Good afternoon, and welcome to the Bob Woodruff Foundation's webinar, Building Stronger Emergency Financial Assistance Programs for Military and Veteran Families. I'm Corey Sellers. I'm a program officer at the Bob Woodruff Foundation. I welcome everyone joining the call today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our expert panelists. For those who may be less familiar, the Bob Woodruff Foundation's Got Your Six network is the largest non-governmental network of organizations serving our military and veteran community. The network includes 400 veteran-serving organizations of varying sizes, maturity, and focus areas. I am confident that the content on this webinar today will be helpful for our partners who are boots on the ground serving the military and veteran community. I'm excited to introduce our panel comprised of Got Your Six Network partner representatives. Joining us today, we have Glenn Wellman, who is the Assistance Operations Manager at Army Emergency Relief. Next, we have Angela Fox, who is the lead SSVF case manager and healthcare navigator at Indianhead Community Action Agency. We also have Kate Hatton, who is the executive director at Homefront Military Network. Hi, Kate. And finally, we have Emmy Hildebrand, who is the chief executive officer at HVAF of Indiana. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. I know we have a lot to discuss, so let's dive in. I'd like to first take a moment to level set our conversation right out the gate. Emergency financial assistance, or EFA, is a stopgap intervention that can prevent financial hardship from turning into financial crisis. Back in 2021, the Bob Woodruff Foundation published a Stand Smart on emergency financial assistance, in which we identified 5 best practices that form a basis for impactful EFA programming. Those practices were paid program staff administering EFA, adhering to a clear set of eligibility requirements, establishing a maximum payment per individual and per household, cash payments made to the appropriate provider or vendor, and that organizations collect participant information and monitor outcomes. Now, of course, that's the abbreviated version, so I believe we're happy to link that full Stand Smart in the chat for everyone to check out if you're interested in reading more. To the panelists, thank you for bearing with me while I laid some groundwork for our conversation. Let's start with a question related to those best practices that we just covered. Can you speak to your processes regarding maximum payment, how you issue payment, and why you've chosen those methods? Emmy, can we start with you?
Absolutely. First, thanks so much to you, Corey, and to the Bob Woodruff Foundation for having us all today. Really excited to share some of our experience in this field. I think those best practices you started with are really, in the most simple way, our process for administering financial assistance to veterans and families in need. We are very aware that different grants have different criteria, both for eligibility, but also for assistance. So I would encourage everyone to first make sure that you're checking your program guides to make sure that you're in compliance. For some grants, it's a dollar threshold that becomes the maximum. For others, it's a length of time of assistance. So it can vary from funding source to funding source. So that would be my first recommendation, is to make sure that you're fully compliant. We utilize volunteers, but not in a case management aspect. So everyone who is making decisions about financial assistance is a paid employee, and they're also reviewed. So if a case manager is working with a veteran, and most of our requests are for things like rent and utility assistance, then they submit a request for assistance, and their supervisor review and approve that. So there are multiple layers of accountability built into that, just to make sure that we're being good stewards of our resources, and that we're stretching them as far as they can to make sure that we're meeting those needs. And we pay vendors directly. We actually use a platform called bill.com to process all bill. Our vendor setup pays be as soon as the next day. We're not worried or someone transporting it on behalf. It's just payment to the vendor.
Thank you for sharing that, Emmy. And Kate, I saw you nodding along there. Anything to add about your processes?
What Emmy said, in general. So I think we agree with all of those processes. Policies are by the board. Again, the point around every has a different of criteria, but about being good stewards of donor dollars, wanting to stretch those dollars as far as possible, but still be able to make an impactful difference in someone's. We want to keep somebody, not have them get become homeless the next month if we paid their rent this month. So it really is about having those policies in place. with the flexibility to make exceptions to rules when times come up. So we have a process. Our board sets policy, the review that everybody goes through, and it happens very quickly. It's really up to kind of the veteran or to make sure they get the documents that we need to review and vet those cases. We also pay the vendors directly, and to make sure that again that the funds are going where they're supposed to be going. So I think, like I said, what Emmy said.
Same thing, in agreement with both of them. For us, one piece that makes it easier, we have all of the same policies in place, but our main grant that we steward, the supportive services for veteran families, they lay out, it's not just a maximum per household, it's also a time frame that's all wrapped into one. So we have a whole secondary, a layer of securities that just kind of goes along with all of those same policies.
And Glenn, anything else to add before I jump in?
Just for us is prior to 2024, we did almost not exclusively, but the majority of our disbursements were still done by old school paper checks. And as of 2024, we were only dispersing about 7% by paper checks, and we mostly disperse by ACH and Zelle now to our clients. And as of just earlier this year, we don't do any paper checks anymore across the board. Those have been eliminated. So just our changing our disbursement method is one of our recent best practices that we've been focused on.
That's awesome. I love to hear about innovations and best practices. And because I can't resist the tie-in, since you guys mentioned restricted funds and monitoring that, I just have to shout out that we did just have a webinar on that, which I believe will soon be available or is available on our YouTube page if anyone is more curious about the restricted fund process. Now, Emmy, you mentioned when you were answering that first question that rent and utility assistance comprises a large amount of your emergency financial assistance requests. I'd love to get an idea of the environment that each of your organizations are operating in currently. So I was hoping we could go around and you could share the most common EFA requests that you receive, or perhaps the biggest challenges in the communities that you serve. And please do share the community that you serve in your answer.
So, HVAF of Indiana is located in Indianapolis, and we serve central Indiana. It's about a 9-county area. And for the last 32 years, we've been focused on serving veterans facing homelessness. So, I already mentioned that many of our requests are for rent and utility assistance. We also get requests for items that are necessary for permanent housing, where we have to be more thoughtful about our funding. So, like when people need their IDs replaced, or they need furniture for moving, or temporary storage. And so thankfully we've been able to seek out different barrier buster fund support to meet those small needs that can be just as important as that deposit or utility assistance, because they would prevent the veteran from accessing housing.
Absolutely. And then Kate, I know you're in Colorado. What kind of emergency financial assistance requests are you seeing commonly?
We primarily a lot of rent assistance. We have by policy we mostly stick with rent or mortgage. Utility bill assistance would be next, and things like car repairs. We want people to get to their doctor's appointments or to their jobs, which keeps them employed and financially stable. So those are the main areas, and kind of the challenges are around cost of living. And we serve this entire state of Colorado, so rural communities versus urban, and then cost of living. But that's a challenge that we see across the board. So what we try and do is where we can help. And then if there's cost avoidance things that we can do to, again, if we can help pay somebody's utility bill so they can afford rent, or we can pay their rent so they can afford that medical bill or whatever it is to keep them, moving forward and financially stable.
And you mentioned rural communities there, Angela. I'm looking at your box. Can you speak a little bit about the communities that you serve?
Yes, so Indianhead Community Action Agency, we're located right middle northern Wisconsin. We cover 20 counties, northern Wisconsin. So it's a little over, I think it's almost 21,000 square miles. And out of those 20 counties, the largest city is at the very top corner of the state with a population of about 42,000. A lot of our towns or townships that you would call them, we're less than 5,000 population. So some of the things that we see, it's the rent, the utility arrears, especially with telephone service and internet included in that, and then vehicle related expenses. That is actually this year probably one of our upcoming most important ones that we're seeing more. The lack of public transportation and transportation options is a very large barrier here. We have veterans that are in very remote areas, and if they don't have a means of transportation, getting them in or out is a great difficulty.
And then Glenn, I believe you kind of have the national perspective here. What areas are you commonly seeing at Army Emergency Relief for emergency
Okay.
financial assistance?
Yeah, so yes, we are, and I guess you could say international across the globe. We have 72 offices located in, Hawaii, Europe, Asia, and of course the United States. We serve retired soldiers, active duty soldiers, and then their families of both, as well as deceased family members of deceased active duty and retired soldiers. That's the community that we serve. So those most common things that we're seeing now or that we assist with most commonly now is rent and deposit on rent for soldiers PCSing and emergency travel. Emergency travel is kind of self-explanatory. We currently provide 50% grant for soldiers that need emergency travel due to a emergency situation with their family, and we're moving towards doing all emergency travel as grants eventually. And then PCS a really stressful time for soldiers, and it's costly. So our intent with that program is to reduce financial stress on soldiers during their PCS. So I would say our biggest challenge is communicating, to our eligible soldiers and retired soldiers and their families. We do have a robust information campaign that focuses on either underperforming categories or new categories so we can get the word out to our clients and customers that hey, this is where we are, this is what we do, and most importantly, this is how we can help.
And you mentioned kind of a challenge that you're facing there. I also know when someone is experiencing a financial crisis, a crucial element of support can be ease of access. And I'm curious more about what other barriers that people are facing when they're trying to access your EFA services, and what have you done or what are you doing to address these barriers?
For us, on March 17th, we launched an online assistance portal. So now we still have partnerships with the American Red Cross and the other military aid societies, but for soldiers and retired soldiers and their families that are within 50 miles of one of our offices, their requests are still processed through that portal, and they go to the local offices. But for everybody else, which is a lot of individuals, um, they can access this directly through our online portal now. So they go to our portal, submit a request, it comes to our headquarters, and we um, process the request that way. So they don't have to get in the car and go to an office or call the American Red Cross or the other military aid societies like they used to, and go somewhere to, maybe pick up a paper check, or maybe the other different disbursement methods they used to use. Now everything's done through our portal, and it has increased the ease of access for everyone. Other than, there is a population like myself that's a little bit, technologically challenged, so that part can be a bit challenging for our elderly population. But we do get on the phone with them and walk them through step by step. So it's really increased the ease of access for our clients.
Two major process improvements you brought up, Glenn, and I'm happy to hear about it. Kate, do you have a comment on ease of access?
Yeah, I would echo that because our business model is nobody needs to come into our office to get assistance. So whether they can't afford the gas to get across town or they're in another part of the state, so that same kind of, and whatever works for them, phone, fax, if everyone ever to use that. And if for some reason they are technologically challenged for either capabilities or access to technology, we have partners throughout the state that they can go to a local place to help them, like a library or a county veteran service office or something. So we really try and make it as easy as possible, and not and to decrease those barriers.
Angela, I saw you hopped off mute.
Yes, talking about some of the barriers, I think with our rural communities, one of the biggest barriers we've experienced in the last handful of years is not only just the lack of awareness. We've worked on strengthening relationships with community resources within those 20 counties just because so many of our veterans are incredibly rural. And then to kind of mirror off of the other two, the digital divide is a very real thing where in these rural areas, if there's no access to phone service or the internet. Some places they would be lucky if they could get dial up, and it doesn't exist. So that is still something that we are working with to try to work through to make sure that we're reaching and being able to get in touch and maintain touch with veterans that are definitely out in the outlying areas.
One thing that I would add to this, we have a really incredible screening team that really triages every veteran's individual situation. And so we've tried very hard to make sure if it's not a resource that we can provide, that we have connections so they don't fall through the cracks. I think, Corey, you mentioned that people are coming to us in crisis. And so when they get passed from organization to organization, it's really easy to get discouraged. So we try to make sure that all the handoffs are warm and that, no one has that opportunity to kind of fall out off of our radar.
I think that's a great point, Emmy, and you're queuing me up wonderfully for my next question. When we're considering ease of access, we've touched on it a little bit, but speed of service is also an incredibly important element of emergency financial assistance, especially for those in crisis. I'm curious, especially about how you balance your eligibility process and how you balance that screening process that you mentioned, Emmy, with a need for rapid response.
I think it goes kind of back to the first question. Different funders have different requirements. So, like Angela, we are an SSVF provider. So, the VA has a very helpful website called Squares. So, you can almost immediately determine everyone's eligibility for VA services, which is very helpful because once we can determine eligibility, we can, place them in a program and get them enrolled and get the assistance started. We've also tried to be thoughtful about veterans who aren't entitled to VA assistance. Indiana has a large National Guard and Reserve population. So we've tried to seek out other sources of funding that could provide complementary services. So when they're not eligible in Squares, we immediately have a resource that is available, and we work quickly. I think veterans can be stubborn and they don't immediately reach out for help until there are no other options. So I think by the time some veterans make the phone call or send a fax for help, it's very late in the process.
And that kind of touches on another point that I was curious about. You've brought up perhaps the technological stubbornness or the stubbornness to ask for help. I'm curious how stigma is playing a role, the stigma of asking for help, especially in the military and veteran community, and how you see that show up perhaps in your emergency financial assistance programming and also what you're doing to combat that.
Yes. So, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because we have had an issue with the stigma of asking for help. That is a challenge for us. And so many years ago, soldiers that were still serving on active duty, they had to be a sergeant first class, a senior NCO or above to have direct access to Army emergency relief. And then we kind of looked at the stigma of soldiers asking for help. And in 2015, we did what opened up a program, what we call direct access, so that all soldiers, regardless of their rank, have direct access to AER. And that's not used to write the soldier's chain of command out of the process at all. It's really used so those commanders can focus on their warfighting mission, and we can help the soldiers that have just the one time issue that came up where they need a hand up for financial help. But at the same time, we also place safeguards in place so that not every soldier will have direct access to Army emergency relief. So soldiers that are in basic combat training or in recently indoctrinated into the Army, they just don't have the wherewithal or the know-all to potentially make those financial decisions without their chain of command knowledge. So we don't allow soldiers that are in basic combat training, or if they have less than 12 months time in service, they're not allowed direct access. And then the other thing is any soldier, regardless of their rank, once they've had two requests in a rolling 12-month period, if they come in for a third request, that's something that we need to do a deeper dive on. And we don't allow any soldier to come a third time in a 12-month period without their chain of command involvement and concurrence and knowing about it. And then the last thing is any commander can identify their soldier is high risk for financial behavior. And if they do, we tag their account with AAR, and that those soldiers, again, regardless of rank, they're also required to have their chain of command involvement when they have a financial assistance request. So that's kind of what we've done to try to alleviate that stigma, to let soldiers know that, asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It's really a sign of strength to have that intestinal fortitude to say, hey, I can't handle this situation by myself, and I'm asking for help, and can you help me? And that's really what the Army family is really all about.
It's a good point about having the command involved. And Angela, I saw you come off mute next.
Yes, just coming off of some of that, especially this last year, more of the demographic of veterans that we have been working with are that 65 and plus, so that the stigma and the belief that it's a weakness or they're not worth asking for the help has been a significant issue. Part of the way that we combat that, I mean, just with the case managers doing the direct outreach. So it's kind of through the process. This is who your first contact is. This is who you're working with. So that's who they get to know. Um, and then also really focusing on that EFA is, it's a temporary stabilizer. It's not charity. It's not a handout, this is a moment and we're going to work through this moment and get you back to the better moment. But I think that focus of just temporary stabilizer, not charity, has made a huge difference in how some of the veteran population, how they look at it, and then how they accept that assistance.
We focused a lot on customer service training and our core values around treating everyone with dignity and respect. I often say I don't want veterans to feel like they have to come here for help. I want them to want to be here because we recognize their service and we treat them with dignity and respect. So I think a lot of that initial treatment, their initial engagements can help reduce that stigma too, that they're not being judged when they're here and that we really are people who just care about them and their family and want to make sure that they get the help that they need.
If I could add to that too, I think most of our staff is military and veteran connected, so we walk the walk, and so there's that immediate rapport. I think that comes with that street cred, if you will. But yeah, and just that I would agree with the kind of comfort level of making sure there's a judgment-free zone, and everybody goes through things, and then trying to get the veterans that we've helped. We get a lot of word of mouth referrals, so our veterans are telling other veterans that, hey, this is an agency that really wraps their arms around you, and that I think makes a difference.
That's an excellent point. I'm hearing a lot, I think, in all of your answers about community, about peer support, and about the way that we talk about emergency financial assistance and communicate that as a stopgap intervention, like you mentioned. And I am going to hop around a little bit, Glenn, because you brought up when a soldier is repeatedly coming in for that stopgap intervention. And when we identify that maybe that's moving from just like a stopgap intervention to a recurring issue. And I'm curious about the measures that you have in place for all of your organizations. When you see a client returning over and over again with additional EFA service needs, like how do you determine when more robust services are needed? And what processes and partnerships do you have in place to address that?
Were you asking me specifically? So for Army Emergency Relief, at every AAR office, we're embedded with the financial readiness program, and so there's a financial readiness program person in the same office as our AAR officers, and so if more robust help is needed, then they're referred to the financial readiness program manager for either additional follow-on budget help where they can help them create a budget and stick to the budget and follow up, also connect them to other community resources and other resources that can help with things that we can't or don't. We've also begin a program evaluation, something it's kind of in its infancy right now, but now we use that to measure outcomes, and we see if soldiers have done things like create a contingency fund after they've had an emergency that we help them with. We can also check to see if a soldier, once they're doing a lot better, if they've maybe donated to AAR as a result of them being helped. Not that it's a requirement or anything, but it's just a piece. And so we actually are hiring a case manager to focus on aftercare and connect with resources at our headquarters. That's coming here very shortly. I think either by the end of the year or early next year. So that's what we do and what we've done.
Angela's programs are probably structured very similar, but every veteran who would be in a position to get financial assistance from HVAF is working with the case manager. So I would say, that setup for long-term success starts in the screening process. What are their barriers? And making sure that when we're enrolling them in a program, if they need long-term help, it's not a short-term program. So that kind of on that front side, we're triaging and placing people in appropriate programs. But I think the key to all of our services is the case management. So that case manager works very closely with that client as long as they're enrolled to make sure that they're making progress towards self-sufficiency. So when it is time to discharge them, they are set up to be successful on their own without further intervention.
I'd echo that as well too. We start at case management, so people may call in for financial assistance. And kind of for context, if we get 3,000 unique clients, less than 200 might get that financial assistance from us. Although maybe half of them call asking for that financial assistance. We're going to do a detailed intake, and we're going to ask what's going on with them, what's their family situation like, what's their discharge status, all the questions that will again drive them to the right resources. And then the financial assistance is a piece of the puzzle. And we want to keep them out of that immediate crisis and keep them from losing their housing, for example, or having utilities shut off. And then we're going to stick with them as long as it takes to make sure that we're looking at not just that veteran's needs, but the family members' needs if they have family members who are part of that equation, who can be providing. Maybe they didn't know they could get caregiver support and someone could be paid to be a caregiver. We also provide financial coaching. We've trained our case managers to provide that coaching in-house so that we can take a deeper dive and look at kind of those, how to address some kind of maybe somebody just it doesn't know how to manage their finances. Maybe there are other circumstances around a why. So we always try to get to the why. What's the reason behind that financial need, and then manage expectations. Our goal is to stick with them as long as it takes, improve those outcomes, so they don't need to come back to us, ideally.
Some of the processes that we have leaned into, especially when we have veterans that we are seeing returning multiple times for the EFA, with the case management, we really lean into that budgeting piece if they're willing to go through that with us. And then if that is not successful, then there's financial literacy resources within the communities and through the state that we will introduce and try to get the veteran and family set and going with that. Now, and we have started to utilize when we have that repeat back in and where they just struggle to maintain that on their own without, the ongoing supports, utilizing, getting them involved with a rep payee, where it's optional that they've come to the point where they are agreeable of getting someone else on board to help them manage their finances. And we have had a lot of luck with veterans that we get onto those services then that are maintaining long-term financial stability because they have that long-term in place.
That's a great point, Angela. And it does touch on a question that I think was in the chat about what strategies are utilized to help individuals with budgeting, to help them with getting out of debt for long-term stability. So just pivoting to that question really quickly, I wanted to see if there were any other strategies that anyone wanted to share about the budgeting process, about getting out of debt. I know that case management sounds like it's been incredibly important. But Glenn, Emmy, Kate, anything to add about budgeting, about getting that individual stabilized?
We've had really good luck with partnerships with banks in the community who will come in and host financial workshops. So they've done everything from how to get out of debt, understanding your credit report, how to eventually qualify for a mortgage. There's another nonprofit in Indianapolis called the Indianapolis Neighborhood Housing Partnership, and we've integrated them into our programming because they have some savings incentives for different programs. So match saving programs or other financial literacy programming that's been really helpful to our veterans.
Kind of wanted to piggyback real quick. I'm not sure in other states, but like here in Wisconsin, we have the UW, the University of Wisconsin, and the Extension office. So if you go to UW Extension, and for the financial literacy, like there is a setup, it's 7 modules where anybody can sign up and they can work their way through it. And then it's for in Wisconsin, like they even have access to for different areas an actual financial person that they can call that will help them with budgeting and kind of figuring those things out. But just the modules themselves is something that they essentially can go through classes and courses. It's free to sign up for, it's free to do, and there is a lot of information there.
And Kate, you said something in one of your previous answers that I really appreciated. You mentioned you would stick with them for as long as it takes. With that in mind, I'd love to shift to what happens after financial assistance is provided. How do you measure the success and assess the impact of your assistance after it's been given out?
From a case management team perspective, we're constantly following up. We're trying to we assign homework sometimes to veterans as well too. That financial assistance just might be the first step, or might be the second or third step, depending on what that person's goals are and what the objectives are and how far deep they are. Is the sheriff going to be knocking on their door tomorrow for an eviction, or do we have some time to kind of work through things? But it's really about again following up, checking in on those veterans, and the family members. How are things going? And then we do follow-up surveys at 30 days and at 6 months to see how things are going, what's working, what's not. But we might stick with them again through that process, and they tend to get better financially over time. We still struggle some, I think, with people who are on fixed incomes, where inflation and things are outpacing their incomes, and there's not a lot we can do about that. A 78-year-old Vietnam veteran is not going back to work, so things like that. So we're trying to figure out where we can help in other ways. But the goal is that our team is provides very personalized, individualized assistance, and as long as they'll continue to communicate with us, then we'll stick with them so that we can keep working with them and make sure that they're not slipping through the cracks.
Any other comments on outcome measurements and how you're measuring the success of your program and following up with those individuals?
We use housing stability and returns to homelessness, which I think are pretty common VA metrics. But I would say we also stress when we discharge a veteran that if they need help to reach back out, so that the expectation isn't just like you were helped once and like move on. Hopefully before they find themselves in full crisis, they'll take advantage of that offer to reach back out. We're also a recipient of the VA case management grant, which can provide some aftercare. So for veterans who might need that little bit of lighter but longer term support, that's a good referral as well.
I'm also curious, like when you're giving these opportunities for follow-up, for feedback from the participant in your program, if it's shaped your understanding of emergency needs, or if it's shaped perhaps an approach that you've adapted to or a best practice. Like Glenn, for example, I'm wondering if you were hearing from your participants about ease of access, and that played a role in opening that portal and getting that going. Like, what are you hearing in the follow-up and the feedback that shaped the emerging needs that your organization is facing?
To be honest with you, we have an individual that runs our survey for us, and they follow up. Everyone gets a follow-up survey. I don't see the results of that very often. However, I do know that it was feedback that pushed us to this online portal in the first place, was trying to adapt and trying to continue to meet the needs of our clients. And so that's how we got there in the first place, was from feedback from not just clients but also our officers out in the field.
Thanks for that, Glenn. And touching on kind of those emergency needs and what you're hearing and what you're seeing, we know that stopgap interventions like emergency financial assistance may always be necessary due to certain circumstances and unforeseen circumstances, but what those needs look like will shift over time. I'm curious how the demand for emergency financial assistance has changed during your time with the organization. I know Emmy and Kate, I believe you've both been with your organizations for over a decade, right? How have you seen that demand shift, and how did the pandemic play a role?
I would say it's been incredible to kind of have a front row to the shift in assistance that's available to veterans. When I first started at HVAF, all we offered was transitional housing. So there wasn't a emergency financial component to any of it. So it was really with the implementation of supportive services for veteran families that we started being able to do that. And I would say I think the VA was kind of on the front edge during COVID of being flexible and creative to try to meet the needs of veterans. It was then that they added emergency hotel assistance for veterans who are unsheltered or living in shelter situations. All of those have been game changers for us. We've been doing over these last few weeks some unsheltered surge events where we've been able to do street outreach, locate veterans, and get them into housing that night. And emergency hotel assistance is a big part of that. So obviously that was born out of the risk of catching COVID in a congregate shelter, but it's a tool that we're still using 5 years later to make sure that veterans aren't sleeping unsheltered. So I think that has been really exciting to be able to be innovative and creative in our space that leads to better services for those who served our country and those who deserve it.
And I would say things changed a lot. We merged two organizations in 2020, and one of those organizations had been providing financial assistance since 2004, since the beginning of the kind of global war on terror issues. And so initially, the organization served primarily active duty folks. Over time, DoD kind of got better at helping families adjust when people were deployed. And so that has shifted to 90% of the folks that we serve now are veterans, and about 10%. The other piece on that is Guard members in particular. And then the pandemic was an issue where it was clear that Guard folks were, at least in Colorado, on Title 32 orders, so state orders that didn't allow them access to federal services like they would be on Title 10 orders. And so we changed our policies to make sure that we were addressing Guard members as well. So that was one kind of factor that the pandemic changed, and we've kept that on. And we adjusted our policies because there were people that we helped, maybe in 2008 and were perfectly fine. And then both spouses lost their jobs in 2020 during the pandemic. And then, okay, second time assistance might make sense in this case. And, what do plans look like? So trying to be flexible and shift as times change. And I would say in the pandemic, frankly, the federal government stepped up a lot and provided a lot of surge funding through the CARES Act and other ways that there were ways to help and provide greater amounts of particularly rental assistance and things like that, and policies around evictions and things that has changed. And so what the future holds is going to be interesting as federal funding priorities have shifted drastically. And so that's going to be an interesting kind of mode to travel, which I think puts a lot more pressure on philanthropy to provide some of these services moving forward. And so I think we're all buckled in for the ride on that one.
And I don't have a decade. I came into this at the end of 2020, so it was like right into the mix. I mean, COVID, it was rent and food. I mean, everything was geared towards rent and food. We've definitely seen more of a shift now with inflation. It's utilities and car payments that those are what we see more. So yeah, it's just that constant flow of always shifting with what's going on with the economy and just kind of moving with that, and then making sure that we're connecting the veterans to other more robust supports to just continue that long-term stability.
And I think that really speaks to something that I think has been coming up as a theme today, which is while we have to have programs and requirements and eligibility set in place, there's a necessity to remain flexible, right? To adapt to the circumstances that are changing. Kate, that was an excellent point that even the population that you're seeing has shifted. And so obviously when your population shifts, perhaps your outreach methods shift. And Angela, you had also brought that up with the aging veteran population that you're seeing and the different ways you have to adapt to that population. So I really appreciate those points being made. I know we touched on this a little bit earlier in terms of partnerships, and we mentioned partnerships with financial institutions, Angela with universities. But as those needs shift and as the population shift, I'm curious if you've developed any innovative partnerships, whether that's corporate, community, public sector, that can help stretch those limited resources and sustain your EFA programming, especially if you have any advice for organizations who are on the call looking to build those innovative partnerships and relationships.
One way we've evolved just in the last couple of years, probably like all of you, we're seeing many more families with minor children. And historically, we had no programming. When we were only transitional housing, we served single adults. And now through our SSVF and permanent housing programs, we have many families with children. So internally, we started something called a Veteran Engagement Committee to plan events to especially connect with those kids But it's been a great opportunity for volunteers to get involved and to bring resources. So we have several members of our Veteran Engagement Committee that are not staff. They're volunteers, and they enlist the help of their corporate foundations or their veteran resource groups to raise funds to do different things. So we've done things like back to school carnivals where we provide school supplies. We just took all of our families, like 70 plus families, to the Indiana State Fair, and their food and rides and entry tickets were all paid for by the philanthropy of those folks who volunteered for our committee. So you never know what will touch someone, but these are people who they're hosting a cookout on Friday for veterans. So it's just a way that they can immediately see the impact of their gift, and it means a lot to those families in our housing.
Partnerships are what we're founded on, really. We've got 54 partners who signed an MOU with us, and they all provide the full range of services that might touch a service member, veteran, or family member, from early care and education, and maybe a Head Start program, again, might help people with, paid for preschool, early care and education, as opposed to having to pay for childcare. And so maybe that's an opportunity for a family. And again, and from a financial assistance standpoint, we work with a lot of different organizations. It might be a local VFW that doesn't have the professional staff to do a lot of that vetting of clients. But if we've done the vetting and we can pay 1 month's rent and they can pay another month's rent, again, that stretches those dollars. And particularly through the pandemic, we found a lot of people coming to us that had $18,000, hadn't paid rent in a year, back rent, back mortgage payments. And so there are a couple of entities, nonprofits in Colorado, that we can help them get connected to those longer term, very bigger dollars that not even 4 or 5 agencies put together could, cobble together $20,000 to help somebody with a year's worth of rent or whatever that looked like. So partnerships are really key to us to be able to stretch those donor dollars. Again, be good stewards of donor dollars, help those other smaller agencies that are volunteer driven be good stewards of the dollars that they have, and really make sure that we are kind of collectively working across the spectrum to help folks.
Partnerships are something that are few and far between in our areas. It's something we are always looking to expand on. We do work with, it is some credit unions for some of that financial piece. The VFWs, the Legions, some of the smaller Salvation Army offices. I mean, pretty much it's when we get into any of those smaller communities, when you have a population of 800, it's getting support from the little local cafe where they're willing to pitch in and help something. So we really lean into community by community because we just don't see too many, whether it's branch areas where they span across all of the counties. So we definitely really rely on that small community support throughout to help stretch those dollars.
Sorry, just jump in one more thing before is that we also work with the national organizations, like whether it's the Semper Fi Fund or USA. Even if it's someone who's not going to qualify for veteran resources, we try and find other resources that may be able to connect them to if they don't have access to veteran resources for whatever reason. But really, some of the other ones are Gary Sinise Foundation things that we might be able to provide some additional assistance at certain times. So again, try and use whatever resources that are available if you don't have those in your community as well.
Our wonderful program officer, Macy Calvert, has been dropping resources in the chat. Macy, if we could also drop a link to the Got Your Six network directory. I know I spoke a little bit about the Got Your Six network at the beginning, but all of these wonderful panelists are members of organizations who are members of our Got Your Six partner ship and network. And we have a wonderful network directory that I think is really helpful. You can search by area, by location for partners in your area of the United States. Thank you, Macy. Appreciate that. And then I'd love to pivot to a question in the chat that I think is interesting, or in the Q&A. One that came up about if your organizations ever identify suspected financial exploitation as contributing to the financial emergency. Kate, I already see you nodding along. I'm thinking specifically about predatory lending. I'm thinking about scams. Angela, you mentioned that aging veteran population that are targeting that population. So I'd love to hear the group's thoughts on that question.
Triggering me in a big way here. There are a lot of people out there. There are veterans paying lawyers to get what they can get free from a veteran service organization in terms of applying for benefits. There are in-home health providers who say, hey, we'll help you apply for those benefits. And then they take all of that money from veterans. And so, there are elder abuse agencies, adult protective services, things that we can reach out to. We used to reach out to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau at times too, to say, hey, there's these fraud things going on, and really trying to educate them. We've had active duty military family member PCSing to our region, and they said, here, again, we're looking at stuff. We look at a lease when they want help with a rent or something, and only to find out that, hey, that person that sent you that lease and is trying to take your money doesn't even own that property. And so when we talk to the landlords, we can find out that whether somebody is being scammed. So we've seen all kinds of crazy things happen. And so again, I think having case managers who are very, very vigilant. And we've had, a lot of them are kind of related to sort of elder abuse and vulnerable veteran scams and kind of caregiver support scams. So sometimes people see dollar signs when they see veterans and vulnerable veterans. And so we work very hard to combat that. Oh, there's a VA fraud line as well, too.
Anyone else? Angela, any comments on the aging veteran population or what you're seeing?
No, kind of the same things. The caregiver scams. We're coming into here October into the Medicare, for enrollments. That time of year always gets busy because then we have the veterans, that have VA health, but they have Medicaid as well or Medicare, and they get the phone calls, or the veterans that don't qualify for the VA health. That is a large one where we'll see, well, if you pay this or if you sign up for that, um, definitely the scams around the healthcare is something that we probably see more than anything.
I would just say we see similar scams around housing. So, Kate, you mentioned it. Someone will try to rent a building they don't even own. Or, we get people who reach out all the time and say, like, I want to rent a room in my house to a veteran, and it's only $1,000 a month. So, that's where our case management staff is so helpful because they're going out and inspecting all of these units and gathering all the information required before we provide any assistance. And so that weeds out a lot of bad actors, but there are many in our space.
Yeah, I mean, for us, I just echo what everybody else said. We see the same things over and over and over again. And I mean, the bottom line is if somebody gets scammed or ripped off and they reach out to us for help, we're going to help them. So we see it too. One of the real common ones, sadly, that we see is we were talking about the aging population is our survivors. I see a lot of them getting scammed, sending money to people that are supposed to, they're representing themselves as soldiers, and they tell these survivors that they're in Syria or these off the wall places, and they need help getting home because the army isn't bringing them home, which is kind of ridiculous if you uh, have any background in the military. But for those that are aging and just don't quite understand, sometimes they've already sent them all the money that they had, and now they're reaching out to us because they need more help. And so we sadly we see that too. But I guess the bottom line for us is we do see people getting scammed all the time, and when we see it, and if they need help, we help them.
Just to piggyback on that, if I can too, so we're seeing people who are caught up with gambling addiction, and things like the psychic network. And so when we're looking at bank statements and we're questioning, what is this charge? What is this charge? And people are very reluctant. Again, that's where kind of shame and stigma comes in, where they don't want to talk about it. But we're going to have those conversations, and we've got partners who can help address some of those needs. I mean, they have to be able to want to be ready for that help, but those are certain things that add to a complexity to a lot of what we see as well.
Yes, suspected financial exploitation is definitely playing a role in contributing to some of these financial emergencies. And from what we're hearing from the panel, it sounds like education. It sounds like reporting it to the proper sources. And that screening can play a large role when you're doing that screening and that budget process of identifying, perhaps like Kate said, gambling charges or predatory practices that way. And case management, the importance of case management. We've heard over and over and over on this call. Emmy mentioned their wonderful case management team that was able to go out, kind of verify some of these financial exploitations and housing scams. So hopefully that helps to answer that question from the chat that's happening. There are ways to go about dealing with it, and hopefully we'll see less and less of that in time. And we're coming up on time. I'd love to end with a question. This webinar is titled Building Stronger Emergency Financial Assistance Programs. And we've touched on a lot of what makes your emergency financial assistance programs strong, what makes them impactful. I'm curious if you have any kind of parting words or words of advice or wisdom for some of the organizations who may have joined today who are seeking guidance on how to build their emergency financial assistance programming. So if we can go around the group, perhaps we'll start with Glenn. And if there's any words of wisdom you'd like to share, please do so.
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, we have partnerships that we've had since our inception 83 years ago. We have some lifelong partners like the other aid societies and the American Red Cross, and then we have more recent ones like Bob Woodruff Foundation and the VA, USAA, and some of these other organizations that we work with. Um, um, as far as building them, in today's day and age, I think that a lot of this social networking and stuff like that is really the way to go. That's how the younger generation communicates. I'm not on social network anymore at all. Maybe if I had a different position within AAR where I had to build these partnerships, I'd probably be on social media. But I think leveraging technology is really the way to go nowadays for building partnerships, whether it's through social media or whatever those venues are out there that I don't use and I'm not 100% familiar with. I just think for the younger generation, if we're going to try to reach them and build lifelong, long-term partnerships, we got to leverage the technology that's out there today that scares people my age and older.
I will second the social media in the last few years, definitely starting to leverage those platforms more than had ever anticipated. Um, I think a big part of just building those is having those good policies and procedures in place and really leaning into that case management and those case managers getting to know those veterans, helping to break down that stigma, build those relationships. Um, case management, I think is just if that's really leaned into, that's a big part of it.
I would just add maybe two words. Make sure that your financial assistance is diverse so that you can meet any kind of eligibility requirements for veterans and that it's flexible. I think, those two things will get you far in terms of meeting the needs of the veterans that you'll see.
I would echo all of that, particularly because we do run into veterans who may not be eligible for certain resources, and so we use community resources as well. But I would hammer home data, collect data about the people you're serving, and then again do that follow up and what their impacts are, but also vetting, not only vetting of the request. Because then you can get back to some of those fraud instances, and really and really vetting of the resources that you're sending folks to, and making sure that you're working with reputable people that you trust and building those relationships and those partnerships, and accountability around financial accountability and making sure you're tracking if you're getting people restricted funds that you need to make sure you have the financial controls in place to manage that. And then I would echo case management, case management, case management.
Case management, case management, case management. I'm loving that. If that's the mantra that people take away from this webinar, I am happy with that. I also love the emphasis on data, on communication, on utilizing technology and diversifying that funding assistance, like Emmy mentioned. I think those are all excellent points. And I just want to close by saying thank you so much to our panelists from today. That was wonderful, wonderful information, I think, for all who have joined. I also would like to thank everyone who has joined this webinar today. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being here. Like I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out a recorded version of this webinar. And if we missed your question, we will try to get that answered by our panelists as well. I also want to stress that these conversations don't end with today's discussion. This conversation was meant to serve as a starting point. We're endlessly grateful to work alongside partners to share strategies and considerations for serving service members, veterans, and their families. And we do encourage you when you receive this recording or with any of the sources in the chat to share that information with your network. That's the closing remarks. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. And thank you again so much to our panelists for being here.